I'm Philip S. Kelly, Major Marine Corps retired. I was born in 1930, December the 28th, 1930.
December the
28th,
mhm.
1930, in San Diego, California.
San Diego.
Right.
Tell me about your family, your parents, your siblings when you were growing up.
Okay, I had a brother, no sisters. I had an alcoholic father, unfortunately. I had a mother who lived to 93, very long-lived genes. And we moved from San Diego to Las Cruces, New Mexico, of all places, when I was just a few months old. So I grew up there.
Were you the eldest?
No.
You're the second.
My brother was the eldest brother. He was almost 20 years older than me.
Oh. So tell me about the school. What school did you go through, and what high school did you graduate when?
I went to Las Cruces Union High. I didn't graduate, but there's a reason. In those days, you could start school in New Mexico when you were 4 years old.
Mm-hmm.
So by the time I was 14, I had all but 3 credits I needed to graduate. My mother was working in Phoenix by then. She got transferred. I had to move to Albuquerque. And first night in Albuquerque, I had a job in a movie theater. I let some of my friends in free. And he said, "You're fired after tonight, but you got to work through tonight." So about that time, in those days, Marine recruiters wore dress blues. So this Marine recruiter walked through the door with a red hat on one arm and a blonde on the other, and the biggest shiner you ever saw. And I said, "That's for me." So it was late June, and he had a quota to fill.
When was it? What year?
It was in late June, 1946.
1946, June. You
And
enlisted?
yeah, and here's how. He had a quota to fill, and I was underage. I was only 15.
Mm-hmm.
So he said, "We won't let that bother us. Wake your mother up and get her to sign this form." So she signed for me, saying I was 17, so I could enlist, and then a couple of years later I corrected the age differential. So I enlisted in the Marines at age 15.
Oh boy, you must have been the youngest.
Well, one of the youngest. I've had some research done. I'm told I was one of the 5 youngest people ever to enlist in the Marine Corps after World War II. There were some younger ones then because the Marines were so big then. But I'm one of the youngest, if not the youngest.
Were you not afraid?
No, I was born fearless, believe me.
What do you mean born fearless?
I don't know. I just don't get afraid of things. It's a good thing because after what I went through in the Marines, I wouldn't have made it if I don't say fearless, but I have a big capacity for physical pain. I stay awake during most operations, and so they put dosum in me, but I watch what's going on.
Jeez.
And
You are terrible.
so anyway, and the other thing is...
So where did you go to get the basic military training?
San Diego.
San Diego?
MCRD, San Diego.
What was your specialty?
Well, in those days, you could enlist for aviation only,
Oh.
and that's what I did. There's more to come, though. I enlisted for aviation only, but all Marines go through the same boot camp. They do now and they did then, no matter whether they were aviation
Right.
only or not.
Yeah.
So the point is, after I was finished with boot camp, then I reported to MCAS El Toro and started training as a tower operator, and then went down to Camp Pendleton to lineman school to specialize in stringing wires. And then later on, not much later, but shortly thereafter, I made Lance Corporal, and I went to NATTC Memphis to train as an electronics technician. And that's what I did that and flying status is what I did for the rest of my Marine career.
Hmm.
When I wasn't serving with the infantry in Chosin.
So wasn't hard for you to get going through all this basic military training at all?
No,
You didn't miss home?
oh no. No, I was from a broken home. I grew up dragging my father out of bars at midnight and put him in the hospital with a ball bat when he beat my mother. I didn't have a happy childhood.
Hmm.
So I was glad to go in the Marine Corps.
Yeah.
And I lived right next door to a retired Marine who got all of his stuff down out of the attic and showed it to me, and I think right at that moment I was hooked.
So you were happy with the Marine?
Yeah, delighted. Best part of my life.
Mm.
It's gone well since, but that's still a highlight.
So when did you leave for Korea?
I was a 7th Marine off the boat to make the landing at Incheon. The 7th Marine off the boat the second day because they first unloaded the infantry to take the beach. There was very little resistance. So the second day they unloaded the air wing people, including me. And so once we secured the city, then I went, so I made that landing, and then I went around to Wonsan, Korea, which is where I wound up going up to Chosin Reservoir.
Hold on. So when did you leave from the United States to? You went to Japan, right?
No, well, no, I went direct over on a troop ship.
From San Francisco?
Yeah,
When did you leave?
I don't know, 6 weeks before I landed, and took 6 weeks to get across the ocean then. And I forget when the Incheon landing was. It was
So September 16th.
yeah, right,
Second day. The first day is September 15th.
right.
And you landed with the 7th Marine on September 16th. So 6 weeks before that, you left from San Francisco
Right.
and directly went to Incheon.
That's my recollection, but I could be wrong. I don't
You never
think so.
stopped in
I don't
Japan?
believe we stopped in Japan, no.
So what did they tell you about the mission? Did you know that you're going to do Incheon landing?
Yeah,
When did you know?
you've got me. In other words, we were told, obviously, before we did the amphibious landing, that there was going to be a beach assault and so forth. And we were not very well informed, and most of them were very poorly trained. I had to teach people how to load and fire a M1 Garand.
So were you not afraid?
Well, anybody who goes to combat's always afraid. It's whether it interferes with you doing what you need to do.
So tell me about the day that you were landing into the Incheon. Tell me the details of the scene. How did you land? What was the reactions from? Were there any reactions from enemies and so on? What was the sceneries of
But
Incheon?
very little, because the landing, no matter what you heard after, was very lightly opposed. And the support troops, and including the aviation people, we were on troop ships, so we went over on the matting on the sides down into landing craft and landed on the beach and went in that way. I helped them establish the command post at the train station in Incheon. There's an interesting story if you'd like to hear connections with that.
Yeah, sure.
It had a lifelong effect on me. What happens when you're in combat and you're in one place, they serve you beef and gravy or chicken and gravy in 5-gallon tins. And what they do is hack them open with a cleaver. And then they always dig a hole and they throw them into the hole. And around our command post, we had barbed wire, which was slanted toward the outside at the top. These starving Koreans were standing outside there. And I mean, they were starving.
Yep.
and the teenagers lifted their younger brothers over that barbed wire fence, tore their guts to ribbons. They got those cans and threw them back over the fence and licked out of the inside of them.
It's an almost empty can, isn't it?
Yeah. All they had in was the scraps because they'd thrown the cans away. But if you're starving, those scraps can save your life. That made a lasting, eternal effect on me. When I got back after Korea, after my first tour, I was there twice. I weighed 138 pounds because I consistently gave away my rations to the population.
Mm.
Then I went, after we secured Incheon, then I was put on a ship again and went around South Korea to
To
Wonsan.
Wonsan. So before you go to Wonsan, how long did you stay in Incheon?
Not very long, I don't recall.
A week?
Probably a week or two. See, I don't recall when the Incheon landing was. So I went to Chosin about 2 or 3 weeks before the Chinese came into the war.
So when you were headed to Wonsan, were you briefed about your mission?
No, not really. They don't brief lance corporals about the mission. They just say do what you're told to do.
But you never heard about where you were headed and why?
No, well, all I knew was we were going to Wonsan. And from there, I had no idea what was going to happen.
Right.
And most of our airplanes were on carrier, but we had support troops ashore, and I was one of the support troops. And at that point, I was specializing in electronics,
Mm-hmm.
and I'd become an electronics technician.
So when you landed in Wonsan, how was the situation there?
As I remember, it was quite stable, and the reason was, at that point, everybody thought we'd be home for Christmas. Nobody except MacArthur's dumb intelligence knew that there was 500,000 Chinese north of the reservoir.
Awakened the headquarters in Japan that the Chinese are engaging.
The mistakes that were made there are atrocious.
Yeah.
And they were very costly in terms of Marine Corps and Army lives.
Absolutely. And that happened in the Changjin Reservoir.
Right.
Tell me about it. And after you landed in Wonsan, did you go to where?
I don't recall how long I was there, but the reason I was in Chosin because I was Air Wing specialist.
Air Wing?
Well, I had a contract to serve in the Air Wing,
Mm-hmm.
okay, but they needed a radio man on a close air support team. So there's something in the Marine Corps called TAD, temporary attached duty.
Uh-huh.
So I was not attached to any of the infantry outfits there, the grunts as we call them. Instead, I was TAD to the regiment, and which was comprised of the 5th and 7th Marines. And my job was to be the radio man on a close air support team.
Tell me about all the way up to Changjin from Wonsan. How was it? Was it cold at the time?
Yeah, but not like it was by the time Chosin.
Mm-hmm.
As I recall. All I recall is Chosin and my 2 resolutions. I never wanted to see any more ice except in a drink, and I didn't want anything more to do with the infantry. So that led to a lot of other things in my military career that I'll go into.
Were there any enemies on the way up to Changjin Reservoir?
Not that we saw.
So you smoothly went up to the Changjin Reservoir, right?
Yeah, the night before they came in, we were all congratulating each other that we were going to be transferred out of there and be home for Christmas.
And tell me about the day that the Chinese attacked you.
All right, to begin with, I was not on the front lines. The Army was on the front line,
Mm-hmm.
up at advanced units of the Army. And so Chinese came in at 3 o'clock in the morning with bugles blaring, and we were instantly awakened and put on full alert but we weren't we weren't fighting with the Chinese at that point. The Army was. They turned, unfortunately, and it was a different Army then than it is now. I have all the respect in the world for the modern Army, but unfortunately they pulled out on either side of the Marines and left their both flanks exposed. And they also left all their dead behind. Brought out their wounded, but brought their dead out. So that's when the fun began, because we couldn't get any air support in. The weather was too bad. And it would have been, because everything was all mixed up and the Chinese were running all over the place, I don't think we could have identified who to drop the ordnance on. So I immediately got my rifle and became an infantryman. So the bulk of my fighting at Chosin Reservoir was getting out of Chosin Reservoir on the road south. I think it was 17 or 18 miles. The Chinese controlled the ridges on either side of the road, and they roadblocked it about every 3 or 4 miles. And then they'd pour fire down on you while you were trying to clear those roadblocks so you could move ahead. What I'm proudest of, we didn't leave our dead behind. We brought every dead and wounded Marine out on the trucks.
Tell me more about the whole the way down to back to Wonsan again. I mean, you know, the Changjin battle is very, very. It was one of the 3 biggest battle in the history of Marine
It was
Corps.
Iwo Jima of the Korean War.
And tell me about more details. Anything that you remember?
Well, what we thought we'd have, because we didn't realize that they'd penetrated as far south as they had, and they'd penetrated down there, I think, before they came in to engage us at Chosin. They were already out there on the ridges, and so they roadblocked the road. We'd go as far as we could, switching off. I'd become an infantryman at that point, so as many of us as could rode in the trucks. The rest of them slogged alongside the road, and we'd switch off occasionally, and then we had to have a lot of space in the trucks for the dead and wounded that we were carrying back. So what was fun was when you hit a roadblock, because they were heavy-duty roadblocks, and as you were trying to clear the roadblocks, they were pouring fire down on you from the hills on.
Where did they get the roadblock? The Chinese?
Yeah, the Chinese set up the roadblock.
What kind of roadblock was it? Was
Well,
it a stone or concrete?
No, I think, as I recall, and it's 65 years, it
Yeah.
was mainly wire, barbed wire,
Barbed wire.
but it was heavy duty enough that you couldn't drive through and knock it down with a truck. You had to get out and destroy what was there.
And whenever you were blocked and they were shooting at you, right?
Right.
So many
From
people
quite
died?
a distance.
From quite a distance?
Yeah, I'm not saying that was the most dangerous thing in the world, because they weren't that great of shots. But the reason they were shooting at us was to interfere with our dismantling the roadblock so we could get those dead and wounded Marines out. That was the main objective, to get them out. If we hadn't been able to get them out, we'd have just bypassed the roadblock and marched back to Wonsan.
On the way back to Wonsan, were you able to eat, and where did you eat? I mean, constantly it was under
Field
the
rations.
Chinese.
Field rations.
Just ration?
Yeah.
Sea
field
ration.
Yeah, rations.
And were you able to? How often were you able to eat actually?
Oh, well, anytime you're in combat, you subsist on field rations, so you eat when you're not being shot at and you get a chance. If it's once or twice or 3 times a day, so much the better. But field rations are not exactly the world's most gourmet food.
But was damn cold, so that all the sea ration I think had to be frozen, right?
No, sea rations are not freezable. In other words, insulate, the kind we had at least, were they couldn't have frozen them if they wanted to. They were powder and vegetables and so forth. They weren't liquid.
So did you have a winter uniform?
I was better equipped than most of them were because I was sent up there as part of the Air Wing.
Air Wing unit has a better.
I mean, I was from the Air Wing, so they gave me my my gear to wear before I left Wonsan. And we were better equipped than a lot of the infantry people were.
But most of them still wore the summer uniform, right?
Yeah. And most of them have this.
What is that?
That's a sign of frostbite.
Yeah.
Almost every infantry veteran you see from Joseon, you'll know whether he's authentic or not. Say, let me see your fingers.
And what about you?
No, I had gloves because I was from the Air Wing, and I wore them. I wasn't anxious to get
You were
frostbite.
lucky, huh?
I mean, they all had gloves, but they weren't heavy duty enough to withstand 6 feet of snow and 40 below zero temperatures.
How good was Chinese soldier? Enemies.
As I recall, they were pretty good.
How? Tell me.
I don't know. They were usually shooting from a long way away. There was very little what I'd call hand-to-hand combat, and they weren't the world's greatest marksmen, but they were apparently well trained and were able to closely follow the instructions of their leaders. They were far from a civilian militia rebel. They were professionals.
Yeah. They were they went through the war in China.
Yeah.
So they are the expert veterans actually.
No, they were very good.
So
who was not very good was us.
Yeah.
Because we did not expect to go back into warfare 4 years after World War II was over.
So if we were kind of hitting about, if we did pay attention to the early signs of Chinese soldiers in the Korean Peninsula, this Jangjin battle and this, tragic sort of battle could have been avoided, right?
The whole thing, in my view, it's a long time ago, but you can all lay it at the feet of the following question. How on earth could 500,000 Chinese hide north of the Yalu River and MacArthur's intelligence be oblivious to it? They never would have had those army troops up there in forward positions if they'd had any slightest insight that they were those troops were up there, and they didn't have heavy artillery or any of the stuff they'd have had, or at least not enough, or any of the things they would have had if they had known they were going into combat with the Chinese army. So he was the greatest actor in the history of the U.S. military.
What do you think really happened? I mean, I did interview a lot of U.S. soldiers. Some of them arrested Chinese soldiers around the north of Pyongyang in early October. There are many signs and reports that Chinese soldiers were found.
Right, but none of those ever trickled down to people at my level. I had no way to know until I read that.
But the commanders, they knew about it.
Yeah, I believe so, but they
ignored
didn't confide in me if they knew about it.
So they intentionally ignored it, or what?
No, I don't think so. I think they
overlooked it.
They overlooked it because it was not anything of any large consequence. There weren't that many incidents. Yes, there were some there, but not enough to arouse a great deal of suspicion. And you want to remember that there were a lot of Chinese population intermixed with the Koreans.
Yeah.
It was North Korea right across the border. So it's easy to see why they were able to pull off what they did. What's unforgivable is that so many infantry professional ground troops could hide on north of the river and not be found by a reasonable intelligence effort.
How do you describe the coldness during that Changjin battle?
It was bone chilling, 40 below, and to this day I'm cold natured. It was awful. Like I said, two sayings were the only place I want to see ice is in a drink, and I don't want anything more to do with the infantry. I'll tell you one other story if
Sure.
you're interested. A human interest story. When we finally broke clear and got through the last roadblock, I happened to be in the lead truck, and there was a hard-bitten first sergeant right in front. And all of a sudden, this colored, I remember he was colored because I remember things, colored MP in a spotless uniform and spit-shine shoes and a polished Jeep stopped this convoy that had spent 2 or 3 weeks trying to get down there. And so he got up, leaned over the cab, pointed his .45 at him, and I'll never forget it. He said, "You doggy son of a bitch, get out of here or I'll shoot you right in the gut." That's the last we saw of him. He jumped in his Jeep and turned white as a sheet, and he was gone. We proceeded on, needless to say.
What were you thinking when you were there and coming down from the Changjin Reservoir, and what were you thinking?
I don't think you think about anything. You just react as you need to react and as you're told to react. And the thing about that war is that to a greater degree than any other war the Marines have been engaged in, we were ill-trained to pursue it. I really had a pretty responsible position, and as I recall, I was a corporal or a buck sergeant. I don't recall exact what rank I held at the time. So I had a lot of responsibility because the people they were shipping over there to engage in this thing, many of them were reservists. They'd never been to boot camp. They hadn't had a rifle training. It was atrocious.
Did you pray?
Never. I'm an agnostic. Yes, I wasn't then. I've become one since. Yeah, I did pray, and later I became an elder in the Episcopalian Church and studied under a Jesuit, but I've never been able to convince myself that religion makes a lot of sense. So I'm an agnostic to this day.
What was the most difficult thing, if you are asked to answer one, during your service in the Korean War? What would you say?
I would have to say it was the weather.
Weather?
Yeah. Because it was the weather that prevented me from doing what I was sent up there to do.
So what happened after you came to Wonsan and evacuated from there?
Well, I went back to the States, and then I went to...
You went to Busan, right?
Yeah.
From Wonsan to
Yeah.
Busan.
And then I went back to the States and went to more schooling in Memphis, and then returned to Korea.
When?
Well, I don't recall exactly. It was probably 3 years later. And one of the only blessings from the Korean War was when you're in a war with a lot of people that are poorly trained, you tend to stand out. So before I was 21 years old, and actual age since I enlisted at 15, I was a gunnery sergeant. Now that's a career. I made it in 6 years.
So you...
So then what happened then was I went back as the a non-commissioned officer in charge of an electronics shop And then as part of that, I'd always wanted to fly, so I flew intelligence missions off the demarcation zone between North and South Korea.
So that was after the war that you returned to Korea, right?
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Did you see the difference between when you were there during the war and after the war?
Well, we were still very close to DMZ, and we never got off the base. So, other than being the main blackjack dealer in the air wing, I didn't find out what was going off the base.
So how long did you stay there?
Well, it was a full tour.
Meaning how many years?
That time, then a tour was usually 15 to 18 months.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to say I was certainly there at least a year. If I had to estimate it, I'd say 15 months. And when did I write it? I wrote it on the Thanksgiving, a little in advance of Thanksgiving, on the 64th anniversary, and sent it out to my clients. And a lot of my older clients knew I had a military background, but some of them didn't. So I sent this out, and you'll see why.
And you wrote it, right?
I wrote it.
Yeah.
The Korean War. Korean War is barely covered in our school's history books, but the savage 3-year conflict claimed the lives of 4 million people, over 36,000 of them American. On June 25, 1950, South Korea was invaded by North Korean forces, supplied with Soviet weapons and directed by Russian advisors. The United Nations voted unanimously to protect their South Korean allies, and 16 countries, including the United States, rallied their troops. The term, quote, police action, unquote, was used by the U.S. government to avoid panic, but the stakes could not have been higher. If the Allied forces pushed too hard, they would ignite a Third World War. If they refused to act, millions of people would be enslaved under a communist dictatorship. Today, South Korea is a flourishing democracy with 50 million citizens living free in Asia's 4th largest economy. A ceasefire was signed on July 27, 1953. However, no peace treaty has ever been signed between North and South Korea, and to this day, South Korean troops and their American allies man posts on the 38th parallel in defense of another invasion. That's a half page. The other is the Chosin Reservoir. Chosin Reservoir campaign marks the pivotal moment when the Chinese army entered the Korean War, prolonging the conflict for 2 more bloody years and changing the fate of the Korean people forever. Thanksgiving Day, this is last year, is the 61st anniversary of that terrible day. At the reservoir, I was a radio man on a close air support team. When the Chinese entered the war, bugles blaring at 3 a.m. on November 27th, terrible weather conditions had shut down our air attacks, and I became a combat infantryman. We sometimes engaged in hand-to-hand combat as we fought our way out through mile after mile of unforgiving terrain and the many roadblocks set up by the Chinese who control the ridge lines on either side of the only road leading to the sea. Ultimately, we saved the lives of 98,000 civilian refugees. On Thanksgiving Day, perhaps you will say a prayer for the thousands of Marines who lost their lives in the forgotten war in Korea.
Beautifully done. You said that you were engaged hand-in-hand combat.
Well, I guess, was I attacking someone with a bayonet? No, but I could see my enemy, watch him shoot at me, so that, in my view,
close.
Combat is hand-to-hand combat.
Yeah, very close. And you saw many of your colleagues being killed.
Yeah,
You saw it.
yes. But then I saw people get killed and everything I did for the rest of my 23 years in the Marine Corps.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a PTSD?
It wasn't called that then, and I never had it. I have a theory about that. We were tougher then than we are now.
Mm.
And also, you didn't have IEDs on the side of the road that could blow your leg off at any. You could usually sense what was happening rather than it being a total surprise.
Mm.
So these wars that are all different than the ones I fought in. What we called PTSD then was battle fatigue. And I'm sure I probably would have gotten battle fatigue if I'd have been kept in the ground forces, because I would have wound up in Vietnam, prowling around in the hills there.
Oh, you went to Vietnam too?
Oh yeah.
Mm.
I was the first Marine aviator to fly 200 combat missions in Vietnam. I wasn't an aviator. I was a radar intercept officer.
So,
Just to bridge the gap here, what the resolution I made at Cho Sen was I didn't want anything to do with the infantry.
mm-hmm.
And in those days, you didn't have to have. You could enlist for aviation. You can't do that now. They assign you to it if they want to. So but the other thing I wanted to do was fly. So that's why I went to electronics school in Memphis, ran the radar shop, and worked on the equipment in the airplanes so I could fly missions in the back of the airplanes. I was offered a temporary commission along the way after 6 years, turned it down. Promotions are slow in peacetime, so it was another 6 years before I got commissioned. But then circumstances had changed, and after I was commissioned, I could then train to get radar intercept officer wings. So I wound up being the senior radio intercept officer in the most famous squadron in the Marine Corps, VMFA 323. So the basic bottom line is I had a wonderful career in the Marine Corps. Did a little bit of everything.
VMFA?
Yeah, VMFA 323.
What is it about?
I'm sorry.
What is that?
That's their squadron patch.
Squadron.
Yeah, it was an F4 squadron, fighter squadron, two-place airplanes.
What airplane did they carry?
No, they lasted 20 years, but
But what kind of aircraft did they have?
F4,
F4?
F4H, yeah.
You mean the Phantom?
Yes.
Ah. So you continue to work as a electronic expert there.
Well, in Korea,
Radar.
now, I was working on the AD aircraft. That was a different. It wasn't a fighter.
But that during the Vietnam,
But
there was
during the Vietnam War,
it was a Phantom.
I was transferred overseas as a most senior radar intercept officer in VFMA 323. Incidentally, my pilot eventually wound up as the assistant commandant for air, which is a senior aviation billet in the Marine Corps.
Looking back all those years, why do you think that you were there in Korea, and what is it? What is Korea to you now?
Well, I'm proud of what I did, but it basically is a bad memory. And it's a bad memory because of all the troops that lost their lives. But the Korean people have really come around. I don't know how often I've been contacted lately that somebody was trying to give me a trip to Korea, and the Koreans stopped me in the street.
You were in Korea? Not here. You stopped in here?
No, I say they have stopped me here. And
You never been back to Korea, right?
I'm sorry.
You never been back to Korea?
No.
No.
No, I would serve 2 tours there, Cho Sen and then the other one, and I've not been back since. Then I served a tour in Vietnam in the fighter squadron, And then the most dangerous tour I had, in my view, was I was back in an intelligence capacity. I helped design the installation, so it was flying missions for the CIA off the coast of Russia.
Why people said that it was forgotten war, despite such tragedy, such loss, and why is it?
Well, I wish I knew. I think for one thing, it came so soon after World War II. Everybody was war weary. They didn't want us to go back to war. They're in the same position now. We ought to be going to war against ISIS tomorrow, but we won't because the American people are fed up with war. Even though they don't fight it, they're fed up with it. The other thing was, it wasn't a war declared by the United States. None of the wars I fought in were ever declared wars by the United States. They were all police actions, and brought on, organized by the United Nations. Rightfully so. I'm not questioning that, but
You mentioned about
it's a forgotten. It's now becoming not the forgotten war.
right.
I'll show you all. I just sent in for my DD-215, and you can see by the hat and the stuff I brought here, my ribbons and so forth. I've got additional decorations awarded by the Korean people in appreciation for what we did, and that is really a great thing, I think.
You mentioned that there is a lack of coverage on the Korean War in our history textbook in high school, right?
No, hardly any.
Hardly any.
Hardly any.
What do you think we have to do?
Going to be a tough problem because it was so long ago. Now, take Pearl Harbor, for example. About the only time you hear of Pearl Harbor is on Pearl Harbor anniversary every year. Take 9/11. Tons of hoopla every year after we lost 3,000 people in the 9/11 attack, year after year after year after year. And after the 10th anniversary, there's nothing. So people have a short memory, especially if they've not got their necks on the line in fighting the battle.
Do you have grandchildren or great-grandchildren, doesn't matter, in the age of high school or college?
No.
No.
I have one natural son that I'm estranged from for various reasons, and I've got two adopted sons, and I've been married to my wife for 53 years, but we were never able to have children.
Mm.
That's the ribbons I own.
Ribbons you earned?
Yeah.
Good. So
And those two down on the right with the brass around them are the latest things awarded to us by the Korean government. I'm a proud member of the Marine Riders of Las Vegas, the oldest by 7 years. I'm still a road captain, a position of responsibility, and highly looked up to.
Philip, thank you so much for coming for the interview.
You bet. Glad to do.